Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive.
Always a pleasure.
Today, we're going to be looking at something you suggested, an excerpt from Sanjay Seth's Postcolonial Theory and International Relations.
Yes, a really fascinating piece.
Yeah, it is. Right away, I noticed that Seth is basically saying that the way we usually understand international relations kind of forgets about something pretty big, colonialism.
You got it. It's like we assume the modern international system just kind of showed up one day, you know?
Right. And Seth's point is that's not really how it happened at all.
Exactly. And a lot of this has to do with how we learn and study international relations, especially in the West. You've probably heard of the English school of thought.
I think so.
Well, their argument is basically that international society got going in Europe and then spread out from there. And it was this like peaceful process that was bound to happen.
Peaceful, huh? I mean, I know a little bit about colonialism and...
Yeah, you're right to be skeptical there. Seth really pushes back against that narrative.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. The conquest of the Americas, the slave trade across the Atlantic, the way entire populations were exploited, these were not peaceful exchanges at all. Things were pretty violent and disruptive.
Yeah, for sure. So it sounds like we really need to rethink that whole peaceful expansion idea. I guess what I'm wondering is, what does Seth offer instead? What does a post-colonial view actually bring to the table here?
Well, for starters, it just acknowledges that Europe and the rest of the world are connected. You know, it's not like separate stories.
Okay.
Seth is saying that colonialism wasn't just some event that happened. It actually shaped the structure of how countries relate to each other.
Interesting.
I mean, even think about international law. We tend to think of it as neutral. But it was originally used to justify colonialism. And that still affects how we view things like sovereignty and intervening in other countries' affairs.
Wow, that's a really strong point. So instead of seeing colonialism as just some phase we've moved on from, Seth is saying that it's like baked into the system of how nations interact.
Exactly. And he uses a really great analogy to help us see that.
Oh, yeah.
He compares it to how women were excluded from the old ways of doing politics. That shaped those political systems in a big way.
Yeah.
And in the same way, the history of colonialism is like built into international relations. We can't just ignore it.
That analogy makes a lot of sense. It's like the system was created with this flaw, and that flaw still affects how it works today.
Right.
But then that makes me wonder something else. If this like Eurocentric way of looking at history is so common, how does that affect how we understand different cultures and how they interact?
You're bringing up a crucial point, and it leads us into the next part of the essay, where Seth really digs into the whole question of culture in international relations.
This should be good.
So the main takeaway is that mainstream IR tries to avoid dealing with cultural differences head on. You know, It focuses instead on these like neutral sounding principles like sovereignty and non-intervention in international law.
Right.
It's almost as if these ideas just exist out there. You know, like untouched by values or beliefs or anything like that.
Okay, but can you really separate those principles from the cultures that created them? I mean, they didn't just appear out of thin air.
You're exactly right, and that's Seth's point. He's arguing that these concepts, even though they're often presented as universal, actually developed within a very specific context.
Well, what's that?
European colonialism.
Oh, okay. I see where you're going with this.
So it's not that surprising that they might have some built-in biases that we don't always see.
Yeah, that makes sense. So even the language we use to talk about international relations is already shaped by certain assumptions. That's kind of crazy when you think about it.
It is, and it makes you wonder how much of what we assume is just taken for granted in IR is really coming from a specific cultural perspective.
Did the essay use the example of international law to show this?
That's right. It shows how for centuries international law was basically used to justify colonial rule. It created a whole system that benefited European powers, while at the same time taking away power from non-European people.
It's almost like the rules of the game were rigged from the start. This is making me rethink everything I thought I knew about how countries interact on the global stage.
And it gets even more complex.
Yeah.
The essay also challenges this idea that we can just neatly equate nation-states with distinct cultures.
You mean like when people talk about like Western civilization or Eastern values?
Exactly. It's as if they are these big blocks with everyone inside thinking the same way.
Yeah.
And Seth really dismantles that idea. To illustrate his point, he uses Benedict Anderson's idea of imagined communities.
Okay, I've heard that term before, but could you refresh my memory on what it means?
Sure. Basically, Anderson is saying that nations aren't these natural groups that have always existed. They're actually these communities that we imagine into being.
Okay.
They're created through these shared stories and myths and symbols, and sometimes even through forcing people to assimilate.
So it's not just about speaking the same language or living in the same place, but it's also about this sense of shared identity that's like actively being created and kept alive.
You got it. And the essay's point is that this process of imagining communities often ends up erasing the diversity that exists within them and ignoring how complex cultural boundaries really are. So we end up with this oversimplified picture that doesn't match reality.
Makes sense. So we have this Eurocentric view of history and then this idea that nations are these clear-cut cultural blocks. Anything else Seth tackles?
Oh yeah, there's one more big one. He questions the whole idea of the individual being like the starting point for how we understand international relations.
Wait, the individual, isn't that like the most fundamental unit of society?
You would think so, right? But Seth argues that this idea of the individual as this like autonomous, rational being isn't some eternal truth. It's actually a product of particular historical and philosophical trends, mostly from the West.
So even the individual, this core idea in liberal thought, is something that's been shaped and constructed over time.
Exactly. And to show how this happened, Seth brings in thinkers like Nietzsche and Foucault,
right,
who argued that the individual was molded by things like Christian morality and Greek philosophy and the rise of capitalism. It wasn't just something that popped up naturally.
That's fascinating. I never really thought about it that way.
It's a really mind-bending point.
Yeah.
And the essay points out how different this is from how IR theory has struggled to naturalize other concepts like the nation-state or the international order as a whole.
Why do you think that is? Why is it easier to naturalize the individual?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
And Seth suggests it's because international relations is inherently a space of constant change and conflict.
Okay.
Power dynamics shift around, alliances form and break apart, conflicts erupt. It's really hard to present a stable, unchanging view of the world when the world itself is so dynamic and contested.
Like trying to build a house on quicksand.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
So while liberal political theory has been more successful at saying this is how humans are, international relations has to wrestle with the fact that the international order is always in flux.
Makes sense.
And to understand that flux, we need to question these assumptions. We've been talking about individuals, nation states, even those seemingly neutral principles.
Yeah, it's a real challenge.
It is. And it brings us to a big question. If all this is true, where does it leave us? I mean, we've been talking about how colonialism has shaped our understanding of international relations, how culture is a huge factor, how even the idea of the individual is up for debate. It's like everything we thought we knew is being questioned.
It is a lot to take in, but in a way, it's kind of exciting, too. You know, it's like we've been given this new way of looking at the world. Yeah, it is a lot to take in, but in a way, it's kind of exciting, too. You know, it's like we've been given this new way of looking at the world.
I think that's a great way to put it. It's not about throwing out everything we know about IR.
Right.
It's about adding in, like, complexity and nuance and, yeah, maybe a little healthy skepticism.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Sanjay Seth's work, what are the key things you want our listeners to remember?
Well, first of all, I think the essay really highlights just how important it is to be aware of the impact of colonialism.
Yeah.
Even today. You know, it's not just about the past. Colonial legacies still affect things like power dynamics and economic structures and even how we think about ourselves in other cultures.
And I think that connects to the second big takeaway, right?
Yeah.
This idea that we need to be critical of those like seemingly neutral concepts we use in IR. Words like sovereignty and international law might sound really objective, but they actually come with a lot of historical baggage.
That's right. And we can't forget about the individual either. It might seem like a really basic unit of society, but even that concept has been molded by specific historical forces.
So really, when we're talking about international relations, we're not just talking about these abstract ideas or states bumping into each other. We're talking about real people with their own histories and cultures and all these power dynamics at play.
Absolutely. And that's where it gets really interesting. You know, Seth actually uses the term Leviathan.
Oh, yeah, from Hobbes.
Exactly. He's talking about how sovereignty is all about the power to kind of impose meaning and stability in a world that can feel really chaotic.
I see where he's going with that. So if international relations is all about this struggle over meaning, who actually gets to decide what those meanings are?
That is the million-dollar question.
Okay.
And it's one that's constantly being worked out and argued about on the world stage. There's no one single Leviathan calling the shots. It's way more complicated than that.
Which brings me to the final thought I want to leave with everyone listening. The essay argues that a lot of what's going on in international relations is a battle over meaning, whose story wins out, whose values will shape the global order. It's something to think about the next time you're reading the news or watching some debate about what's happening on the world stage.
Couldn't have put it better myself. Just keep questioning, keep digging deeper, and most importantly, keep an open mind.
Thanks so much for joining me for this deep dive. It's always great to chat with you. And to everyone listening, happy exploring. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into some really thought-provoking stuff.